Working Cows Podcast, episode 293. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be joined once again by Gabe Brown, and welcome to the show for the first time, Matt McGinn. Very excited to share this episode brought to you by Understanding Ag as part of the series that we're doing together. A couple of episodes a month, kind of revamp my strategy, releasing about an episode every other week now with them, generally on Fridays. Again, the best way to make sure you don't miss one is to make sure you're subscribed in your favorite app. You can do that at workingcows.net/subscribe. And we'll be dropping some stuff in the show notes page for today. Workingcows.net/293 will be the show notes page for today. Workingcows.net/293. You can go there and find some links to relevant content from Understanding Ag and some things that are germane to this discussion that we're going to have today about the transition into adaptive grazing and adaptive management that they have been a part of on the McGinn Ranch. So would encourage you to check out that show notes page for today at workingcows.net/293. We're going to be talking to Matt McGinn and Gabe Brown today, kind of about the journey that the McGinns have been on towards a more adaptive style of management. Very much looking forward to this conversation. So, Matt, welcome to the show for the first time, and Gabe, welcome back once again to the Working Cows Podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. Thanks, Clay. I hadn't mentioned before, Clay, but I have listened to a lot of your podcasts. So, yeah, it's an absolute pleasure for you guys to ask me to do this. I'm looking forward to it.
Great to be with you again, Clay.
So, yeah, Matt, I guess I'd like to just kind of hear about your path into ranching. How did you get started doing what you're doing now?
It's a great question. I actually grew up on my family's ranch. It's a McGinn Ranch. It was established in 1891 by my grandfather. And so then my dad and my Uncle Mike actually ran the McGinn Ranch for basically the last 50, 60 years. So when I grew up as a kid, we actually had two ranches. My Uncle Mike's ranch, and then our home place here, where my dad and I ranch now. So basically, all my life, we operated two ranches. We were this is fun. We were a dual herd. We were your typical spring cows. We calved the end of February and March with those spring cows. And then we followed up in the fall. We would start calving fall cows in September. And then, just your typical ranch. I mean, we were, easily putting up anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 bales of prairie hay every year and turning around and feeding all those. And then we were big in the set stocking, just your traditional, figure however many acres per cow. Well, down here, it's about 10 to 12 acres per cow. And so we would set aside so many acres in the summertime to graze all summer. So you'd take whatever it was, 40 head or 50 head of cows and put in this section all summer long. And then the other half of the ranch was set idle until July 4th. And then we hayed all that ground. We basically hayed from, it's crazy to think where we are now compared to where we were, but I've heard this story a lot from different people. But we would hay from July 4th to almost September. And on that hay ground, it was your traditional, like we would harrow it and then obviously hay it and then come back around in the fall and graze the regrowth. And so that kind of gives the brief history. Before we got into adaptive grazing, I mean, it was just, it was high input. Those fall cows, we were feeding 50 pounds, at least 50 pounds of hay a day. And our spring cows were easily getting fed at least 40 pounds of hay a day. We reached a point where I went to college at the University of Nebraska and got a degree in diversified ag. And then I wanted to come home and ranch with my dad. But I've talked with Shane New and I've talked with Doug Peterson before and some others. Like, it was my observation through all this time, like, you could see the stress load. And I think Gabe could relate to this. I think anyone that's been in conventional farming and ranching can relate to this. You, as a young person, you almost feel like you're getting pushed out because the older generation is trying to tell you that there's not going to be any money to be made in this. And so when I graduated from college and as I come home and I would listen to these stories, I would observe the amount of stress, and you can kind of see this, you might say, train wreck developing. And the whole time I would sit there and be like, it's so interesting to me that we're sitting on a $10 million asset, but we're not seeing the return that there should be. So that kind of gives you a little brief history. I don't know if that segues into your next question, Clay, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, it does. I guess I'm kind of curious. Are you kind of then central Nebraska? Is that where you're at?
Very central. Yeah. We would be almost right in the middle, right around Broken Bow, Nebraska. The small town that we live in is called Anselmo. It's about 30 miles north of Broken Bow. It's a unique area of the Sandhills. It's right on the edge of the sand and the hard country, or the clay country. So about 10 miles south of us is where the farming begins. And then where we are north is pure sand. And now our place isn't your traditional, like the big sand hills. It's more low ground, a lot of wet meadows, more smaller hills, choppy sand dunes. So it's kind of unique in that aspect. There's some heavier soil, still a lot of sand, but a lot of low ground, a lot of wet meadows.
Sure. So you mentioned the journey into college and diversified ag. Did that diversified ag prepare you for what you're doing now, or was it something that you had to unlearn?
Well, I'll tell both of you guys a very funny story because both of you know Burke Teichert pretty well. So I'll tell you a little story about my college and how it ties into Burke Teichert. So when I was in Cal-Calf management at the university, I can't even remember what class it was now or what number it was, but we had a day where Burke Teichert come in to visit with us. And I think at the time Burke was managing the Rex Ranch, and I love telling this story to Burke. So Burke stood up in the front of the classroom and presented some of the principles they were doing at the time at the Rex Ranch, which, that's 20, 25 years ago. So we were kind of for some of us, that was new thinking on this rotational grazing, regenerative ranching at the time. So those principles were pretty new. And I sat in the back of the classroom that day with my friends, and you can all imagine when we listened to Burke, we basically laughed. Like, this guy's a clown. Like, this is not where I'm picturing ranching going. At that point in time, it was going to be high input. We were going to set the world on fire. We're going to run 1,000+ head of cows, and so Burke come in there with this, low input, not a lot of equipment. The equipment that you do have, you want it to be good for the people that are working there. And I specifically remember sitting there that day, like, there is no way we will be ranching like that. So I've visited with Burke 2 or 3 times since then. And 25 years later, we are basically doing what Burke had said back then. So Honestly, no. If you really want to know, no. Other than just the social aspect of college and the people that I met playing football, I really didn't get a huge much out of my college education.
So, how did you get to where you are now? What was the journey into adaptive grazing like? What piqued your interest originally?
Absolutely. And it's a great question, and it's one that Shane knew loved. So my background, I went to college, I played football at the University of Nebraska, and I walked on and played football at Nebraska. And then when I was done playing football and graduated from college, I moved home. And, of course, football was a huge part of my life. So obviously it's hard to let things like that go. So I had the opportunity to be the head coach at our local high school for 16 years. But one of the most interesting things in the football world compared to the ranching world is in football, every year, starting about now until August, you hit the road and you are in conferences, you are at different colleges, you are listening to coaches about every week, whether it's on campus, or if it's at a specific hotel where there's a clinic going on, but you are constantly educating yourself. And what blows my mind, Clay, is in the football world, people share videos and information it's crazy. Like, you can call major colleges and they'll give you all the information you could ever want. And so when I moved home and got back into the ranching, it was hard to find any new information, like to continue your education. And so, I think I was reading just a typical magazine. I can't remember what it was at the time, but there was an article in there about ranching for profit. And so I read it, and I think the advertisement claimed that, you would increase your carrying capacity, you could run more cows, possibly make more money. Well, that sounds interesting, I thought. So I showed it to Dad. Oh, I don't know why we would do something like that. And the cool thing is I finally convinced my dad. I'm like, Dad, in the football world, you're almost encouraged every year to go somewhere to learn skill sets about the game of football from new people every year. So like our high school administration, they want you to go learn more and more. So I told Dad, I'm like, so I understand why ranching is not like that. And I said, so here's an opportunity. We can fly to Abilene. At that time, we flew to Abilene, Texas. I think it was back in 2010. And we did the Ranching for Profit School. At that time, it was with Dave Brott. And so the one thing I will add really quick about my dad and the older generations here on the ranch, and I tell a lot of people this when I do talks, is the goal here was not to trash what they had done in the past. And the things that what they thought they were doing, they thought was right for the time. And so I like to tell people, like, this had nothing to do with what they were doing, but I thought we could actually do what they've done better. And let's go to a place where we can sit down and then start to maybe see things in a different light. And those of you that know Dave Pratt really well, you can giggle, because I remember specifically Dave and my dad about every evening having a couple beers and smashing heads together because they're both type A, that hard charging mentality. And but Dave got his spurs in my dad. And so Dave told Dad, and that was in 2010. So Dave told Dad, 10 years later, you'll be one herd, you'll take in cattle, you won't do very much haying. I can't remember what else, but that's basically where we are. And so kind of gives you an idea there.
Yeah. So what was the first thing that you guys changed when you came home?
The very first thing was, well, I can tell you exactly. This is fascinating. So here on our ranch, we have, and I've written an article that I need to send to Shane, but we have what they call blowouts. And so what that is that's erosion areas and along the fence lines and around the windmill areas, and they can be ungodly. And I think I sent you an email, Shane, to kind of describe. So basically what they are is it's a huge ripped out erosion area where the wind comes in and just opens these giant areas of sand. And so when we got home from ranching for profit, we had your typical ranch. We actually had a 4-section pasture with no interior fence line. And we had ran our fall cows in there for years. And the blowouts in this pasture they were unbelievable. The fence line blowouts and then the erosions around the windmills. And so the very first year, Clay, we went in and took one single strand high tensile line and we split that 4-section pasture into two section pastures. And we did a traditional, this is so funny, but we did a traditional, we grazed 30 days on one side, and then we would move the cattle across the high tensile, single strand high tensile, graze 30 days on the other side. And we did that back and forth until probably October that year. And, took the cattle back home and traditionally grazed the meadows that we'd hayed that winter. And Dad asked me, he goes, well, what'd you think of the rotation? And I'm like, I don't know. It seemed like it worked. So the following spring, we went back in there and we're fixing the fence lines. And these fence lines can be, and you might know, Clay, but these fence lines can be horrendous because they're either completely buried every year or they're completely blown out of the ground in these blowout areas. And they have been a headache on this ranch for 50 years or more. And it was to the point where this is just what happens, and there's really no way to fix this. So just after we put a single strand high tensile and we did just a basic 30-day rotation on each side of that high tensile, the following year we went back in to fix the fence in the springtime, and I'm standing there in one of the blowouts, and all of a sudden I see that one of these blowouts is starting to cover. There's actually starting to be some grass growth in this blowout. I had no idea what had happened. All I know is I observed that there was some growth, this blowout had started to heal with some grass. That's all I knew. So we went through, started and fixed the fence and the rest of the pastures that spring. Typical blowout, terrible, and didn't show any signs. So the following summer, we split that again, and then we did just a 2-week rotation through the 4-section paddocks. And then the following spring, we saw even more healing of those blowouts. And then about that point in time, Clay, I wanted to know more about intensive grazing. So that's when we ended up, I actually flew to Mississippi and took Jim Garish's management intensive grazing class. And I think I told Doug Peterson at the time, I was lucky at the time, Allen Nation was still alive at the time. So I was fortunate. I got to spend 2 mornings with Jim Garish and Allen Nation just eating breakfast. Unfortunately for me at the time, I was too young to appreciate the conversation. But so that actually led, I took Jim's conference, and then I spent I think Dad and I spent 6-7 years with Jim putting in quite a diverse grazing plan. We actually now have a 3-inch pipeline that runs for 8 miles. And what we did there to design that, we actually took Google Earth and then we drew a 1/4-mile circle around each existing water point. And this was really good for my dad. And then this was Jim's approach at the time. So we drew a 1/4-mile circle around each existing water point, which were mainly windmills and a few solar wells at the time. And then the areas outside the 1/4-mile circle, we actually colored, I think we colored it green. to give my dad an idea of the underutilized acres on this ranch. And once my dad saw the picture of the underutilized acres and how we could increase carrying capacity, and basically the old saying was, we'd add the pipeline and all the fence and you could buy another ranch for, next to nothing. And we've all heard that. So anyway, once we drew the 1/4-mile circles, we saw the underutilized area. Jim and I created a 3-inch pipeline that runs for 8 miles, and it basically runs right down the middle of that basically right down the middle of the ranch. And then we ran 2-inch stingers off the 3-inch line to start to fill in those underutilized areas. So at the time, to figure out the fencing on a big area, Jim wanted me to use polywire. We laugh about this now. And I think a lot of us have done this. So instead of putting in a bunch of permanent high tensile fence, we were stringing polywire like crazy. And not just, like we were stringing mile and a half lines. And I think my kids would kill me now. And so we strung the polywire for probably 2 to 3 years until if I put a polywire in the same place for 2 or 3 years, then we finally started putting in like single strand high tensile. And so I think now, Clay, we're up to 100 paddocks. I'm not as good as Alejandro. I think Gabe would appreciate that. Alejandro sets the bar high for us. So, but we probably started out with 10 paddocks, and now we're probably pushing 100 now. And so at the end of I shouldn't say at the end, but Jim finally got me, when Jim Garrish finally got me talked into rotating every 3 days, that's probably when we started to see the biggest improvements on the ranch. I would say I don't really necessarily get hooked on the 3-day or a 14-day. I really like what Understanding Ag does, and then working with Alejandro, and then we'll get into that later, how I ended up being introduced to Alejandro and why Alejandro come to our ranch. I like the adaptive side of it, because I think I've seen on other people's ranches that sometimes we get so hooked on the prescribed, like we got to do a 3-day or we got to do a 14-day window, and we lose observation. Like for me, Clay, when I really started to understand this is when I don't even remember who taught me, or maybe I taught myself, when I learned to use a grazing stick and actually get in the pasture, get down on my knee, measure the forage, measure the dry matter, what's available dry matter in the pasture. And then all of a sudden, like, you got your smartphone, you got the picture this app or whatever. So you're measuring the forage, and now all of a sudden you're taking pictures of the plant, or, plant type, looking at diversity. That's where I think it really started to go to the next level. And so then you could, as you measured that available forage, you could say, okay, well, we can do a 3-day grace period. We could do a 10-day grace period. And, you could begin to chart that mentally. You can chart it on paper, but I mean, that's kind of where we got to, or kind of where I got to.
Sure.
At that point.
Yeah, I've been in the Sandhills a little bit, and I've been in the Sandhills enough to know that it's terrifying country to ranch in, because if you're not careful, your whole ranch will blow over to your neighbor's house. And
exactly.
I guess, so you've talked about some of the changes that you saw as far as those either buried fence lines, or so much of the topsoil had blown away that now the bottom of the post is exposed. It's kind of two extremes of the same issue.
Right.
You started to talk a little bit about diversity there, but productivity, water infiltration. Like in my neighborhood, I struggle to get water into the ground because it's heavy clay soil. In your neighborhood,
absolutely,
you can get it in there, but you can't hold on to it. So, I mean, it's two different. We have two different struggles. But can you talk a little bit about what you've seen as far as changes in that regard, as far as water holding capacity, species diversity, some of those things?
Absolutely. And great transition, because this leads right into Alejandro. So we've done this now for probably 7 to 10 years. And, working with Ranching for Profit, and then working with Jim Garish. And we worked our way finally down to, moving cows in the summertime every 3 days and grazing cows longer in the winter, moving the cows, to a May, June calving. So we started, slowly, grazing longer in the dormant season, cutting away the hay. And so as we did the 3-day and started to move down this path, yes, all of a sudden, more and more plant diversity, more native legumes started to show up, just more ground cover in general. And and I think Gabe will laugh at this as I get into Alejandro, but I'm so passionate about ground cover. It is such an overrated thing. Like Jim Garish called it wasted grass. And my neighbors look across our fence, and I probably get at least 10 phone calls a year wanting to, they want to bring their cattle here in the fall. And I'm like, no, there's a reason I want. I am so passionate about no bare ground. And so this is unique. So we went down this path. We'd worked with Jim. We had 3-day grazing. We started to see plant diversity. We're building soil organic matter. Bare ground's going away. In 2020 and 2021, we had unprecedented rainfall here. And I would love to show you a Google Earth image of our place, but I would say close to 70% of our ranch was underwater. And I mean, we've always had ponds here, and we've always had ponding, but this ponding was extreme. And so I'd reached a point where I'm like, okay, I need a guy to come in here with a new set of eyes so I had looked at the Understanding Ag. I really liked their approach, and I liked the 6 principles of soil health, all of it. And so I got a hold of Shane New, and Shane's like, and I told Shane my background, and Shane's like, we kind of need somebody to go there to kind of raise the bar for you, if you would. So that's how Alejandro came. So I brought Alejandro in to fix this ponding problem, because we at that point in time, we had giant water holes. And these were in areas, Clay, that we had hayed when I was a kid. I mean, we're talking entire valleys underwater. So I'm sitting there just on pure observation. Like, I'd seen how we adjusted in the 3-day, and, you continue to read books and listen to these people. So Alejandro showed up, and we're out in the pasture not even 2 hours the first morning. And we're sitting up on top of a hill, and I'm asking Alejandro, I'm like, man, what? Do you really think that this sand can compact? And, of course, he giggled. So we actually dug a hole. And first hill range we were on, we dug a hole. And we were looking at the short root system, sideways roots. And that was one of the first times I'd actually had somebody dig a hole with me and show me the short root structure, just, the sideways roots from up on the hill range. That was from overgrazing. So then we went down in the bottoms where it should be highly, highly productive rangeland, especially in our area. If you look at the ecological site assessments, well, we started digging holes down there. It was even worse in the bottom, Clay. So we started, Dad and I and Alejandro started visiting about this. And it was years and years, Clay, of overgrazing or undergrazing and haying. And the haying, Clay, after we finally wrapped our minds around this, and I've heard Dr. Williams talk about it, I think I've heard Gabe talk about it, a lot of people, the haying is so destructive. And we were even better at it because we harrowed everything. So we would go across it with a harrow. Then we would we would straight rake it or run a dump rake over it. Then we'd bale it, and then we'd scatter rake behind the baler. So we were leaving no organic matter on top of that ground. And this probably went on for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And slowly, once I figured out the short root system, we started probing, we started looking at all these things. Alejandro and I started looking, and then the light finally come on. And then so, the goal was now to build more organic material. The crazy thing is, and I've heard, Gabe, I think you're big on this, it was the loss of aggregate stability. And the first time I heard Gabe Brown talk about the loss of aggregate stability, that's exactly what had happened here, even in sand. And what we've seen now, Shane knew was out. He'd stopped by our place last fall, and it hadn't rained here. I don't know, Clay. It probably hadn't rained most of the summer, and I'd have to go back and look. But Shane and I actually dug this soil sample up, and you can actually see black soil. And then we probed this, but you can see the black soil. You can start to see the aggregate stability, and that soil was moist. And that was probably, just that alone was probably built in maybe a 3 or 4 year time period at the most, just through rotation, leaving that wasted grass or building that soil armor. So you could automatically start to see results, and it's very encouraging.
Matt, if I may, has your father been able to see that?
Okay, Gabe, this is what I love about understanding ag and working with Alejandro, and it's a great question, and thank you for asking. So when we started this, Gabe, and I think you would agree when you started, a lot of this was theory. Like, okay, if we rotate the cows, in theory, this is going to improve or heal the land. So when Alejandro was here, we started shoveling. We're reading the bricks tests. We did the water infiltration tests. We're doing all these tests, and it gave my dad something visually to look at, and he could see improvement. And as soon as he saw that, Gabe, it was full bore, and more fence line, more water line, because you actually can see that improvement. But Gabe, what I find interesting, the more we do this and the more I visit with the older generation, they've seen and made these observations in their lifetime. Like, I'll take Dad out and we'll look at these things, and he'll all of a sudden be like, well, we used to do it. And I'm like, how did this change? And we get I think we got so wrapped up in the technologies. And I guess we can thank like Vermeer and the balers and all of this, but we've lost that power of the observation. And what I love is when we use these tools and we sit down with the older generation, you can see the light come on in their eyes. Like, we've already done this before, and they get so excited, and it gets them back out in the pasture. And so absolutely. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. I think kind of what you're talking about is industrialized nutrient exportation. When you're talking about all the raking and all the haying and everything, you're just absolutely taking everything you can off of there, and that's the problem.
Exactly.
Yep. So, what about changes to your cattle? We've talked a lot about ground and grass and those things. What about cattle? How's that journey been?
This has been an interesting journey, and it'll be fun to visit with Clay about this, or Gabe about this, or both of you. This was the hardest thing for me to wrap my mind around, and thank God for Shane and Alejandro and even Jim, all of these people that I've had the fortunate to work with over the years, and that told me just to stick with it. Because it was the hardest thing when you go from the February, March, and we sold. So basically, we sold all of our fall cows, And then this is we could argue this point. What we did with our spring cows is we slowly moved them back. At times I've talked to Dave Pratt over the years. Dave thinks we should have just pulled the trigger and moved them the first year, got through the loss. The biggest thing, guys, and I think I've heard Gabe talk about this, and a lot of people, is dealing with the peer pressure, because you're going to a more, which I love listening to Dr. Williams and everybody talk about this, the short, moderate, thick, wide cattle. Basically, it's the cattle that Mother Nature is selecting. And it's probably taken me 5 years to 5 to 6 years to get there. It's riding, to me, Clay, it was riding the fallout. But when I say the fallout, it was the, Gabe, I think you could relate to this. It was the years of me or our ranch breeding high input genetics, and I look back now, I don't even know what the heck what we were chasing. I think we were being lied to. Well, I know we were being lied to, but it was breeding this high input genetics where, we're going to feed 50 pounds of hay to get these things through the winter time. We're feeding all this cake. We're looking at our winter feed bill and scratching our head like, where is this 100,000 going? Or just using that as an example, like, where's $100,000 going? And so I told Dad, I said, after visiting with Dave Pratt and them, like, we're going to do it. We're going to back it up. We're going to calve in May and June. And then we're going to let Mother Nature select what stays and what goes. Probably, Clay, the biggest thing that helped me in all of the grazing was learning to winter graze. And winter grazing, to me, is that more phenomenal. Learning to winter graze has taught me more than summer grazing. Because when you become a 365 day of the year grazer, and now granted, like this year you get these weird 27 inches of snow, which Gabe's used to, but I'm not. But learning to graze 365 days a year and planning that grazing out, you become very, very good at observation and grazing. And I think that was one of the big things as you learn to adapt those cattle to wintertime grazing. And so our animals, Mother Nature has selected, just like what everyone says, they're short, deep, thick, and wide. But it's the animals that have to learn to graze on brown forage most of the year. That's what you're looking for, and that's the phenotype, and that phenotype shows up right away. So now we calve in May and June. We breed. We give all of our heifers a chance to breed, and then what I do now is I have our nucleus cow herd, our main cow herd, and then I keep all my yearling steers and yearling heifers over the summertime and graze them and make long yearlings out of them. And then I take in roughly about 450 head of red heifers. So the reason I structured this was it's all centered around the cow herd and drought management. And the reason I say that, in 2012 here, we were running at max capacity with a spring and a fall herd, and we had no drought plan at that point in time. So the drought plan was to panic when we were basically out of grass and then sell most of our fall cows. And I specifically remember my Uncle Mike standing at the chute that day, and he said, "Isn't it amazing that a lifetime's worth of genetic work on a set of cattle goes up the chute in about 30 minutes? And everyone was real quiet. And matter of fact, they were pretty much sad. And I remember getting home that night, Clay, and I remember telling my wife, I never want to be in that situation again, ever. And so that was probably another transition into the adaptive grazing. And so now I show a picture when I talk to people. I show a picture. It looks like a cell nucleus, and I draw circles. And in the middle of the cell is our cow herd. And then the next ring outside of our cow herd is our yearling heifers and our yearling steers. And then outside that ring is our take-in bred heifers. And so I set trigger points based off of rainfall, like we've all learned. You know, if it hasn't rained this much, then I tell the guy that I take in cattle for, like, it's not happening, man. And so then I'll call those take-in cattle, and then that'll open up that much grass, more grass for the summer and even into the winter months or whatever. And then as we move along, the next trigger point is my yearling steers. And then, so if it looks cloudy, then I'll trigger those yearling steers. And then yearling heifers, of course, I'll breed them along. And then the ones that get bred, they'll stay. And then obviously we'll sell the opens. With the cow herd, then as we work into the trigger points, then I'll call older cows or, you know, cows that we don't like. So I'm ending up sitting on a young cow herd. And I guess another unique thing we do here, I don't know if I learned this from Burke Teichert or what. I do the long grazing season, or excuse me, the long breeding season, and then the short calving window. So I'll run those bulls, you know, I'll put the bulls in August, and a lot of times I leave them in clear to December. And, you know, just trying to add value to cold cows, you know, late breds or so when you get into one of the things sorry being random, it's just ideas are coming in my mind. One of the things when we got into the May and June, my dad panicked because we were so used to marketing in set windows in the March, when we were March calvers, and even when we were in fall calving in September. Our March calves were always marketed in January. We weaned those calves. Traditionally, we would wean those calves in November. We'd feed them a grain mix and hay, trying to get them to weigh 650 to 700 pounds in the January market. Okay. And then our fall calves, we could get into a whole nother podcast on our fall calves, because we actually held our fall calves on the cows all summer and then sold them in August off the cow. So Dave Pratt and Dad got into a fight one time about those fall cows, because Dave's like, my dad's name's Butch. He's like, Butch, did you ever think about the opportunity cost on that ground of holding those fall calves? Anyway, long story there. So when we got into a May-June window, the marketing of those cattle changed. And everyone told me that it's easy to market a May-June calf because you're constantly, you know, the calf's growing and you're hitting a unique set of markets as that calf is growing. Whether you're going to go to grass with them in May, or you get halfway through the summer, or you do a long yearling in August and September. You've got all these marketing windows. Well, my dad just paradigm-wise, he just could not see that. And so finally I'm like, well, we're doing it. And we're just going to jump off the cliff, and hopefully we can build safety nets on the way down. So, but honestly, Clay, it was the greatest thing ever, because now we hit all these marketing opportunities. You can forward contract. I mean, you've got all this available opportunity. That was just on the calves. What blew my mind is the cold cow market. So I almost think the cold cow market's more lucrative than the calf deal, because you're selling cold cows and basically the 1st of July when there's no cold cows, and it's the peak of hamburger season. So, I mean, I got guys that called recip wise. I mean, marketing cold cows is an easy deal in a May-June calving window. But yep. I'm going to give a shout out to Gabe here. One of the best things that I've done was later weaning. And this was a fight. This is a fight with my dad, and this was a fight with myself. But I called and I visited with Burke Teichert, and I visited with a lot of people. So the last 3 years in a row, I just weaned my calves. Clay, I just weaned my calves last week. And hopefully next year I can get to April 1st, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, Gabe, is that about the time you wean? Is around April 1st or somewhere in there?
Well,
anyway,
I must be following you, because we just weaned last week, but it was only because the snow's getting way too deep. So, yeah,
absolute game changer for me. I mean, if we went back and I can give you guys an idea. 3 years ago, I was calving in May and June, and I weaned about the 1st of December. And if I could go back and look, I'm pretty sure on this, but on the numbers. But so I weaned those calves in December. Just the steer calves alone, feeding them a grain mix until May, because that's what you got to do. You got to put all these inputs in it so you can sell a big calf. Anyway, I had probably close to $50,000 in just grain mix cost alone to get those steer calves through the wintertime to grass. To give you an idea, in the last two or 3 years, leaving those calves on the cow until now, and then I turn them out, and I might feed them a little bit of hay, maybe a distiller pellet, just to give them some energy to get us to green grass, but not very much. You're looking at, the cost was $50,000 the year we did it in December, and I think the last 2 years I probably had maybe $2,000 to $4,000 at the most until we're back on green grass.
Yeah.
So,
Matt, let me interject there a little story.
Sure. Yep.
About that, because obviously what we've done on our ranch mirrors closely to what you've done. Went from early calving to mid-May through the end of June, and leaving the calves on, and realize you're talking to a guy who had a bull sale for 20 plus years and was used to selling and graining and feeding big bulls. And so we made the switch, and we did it cold turkey and left the calves on the cows. And I'll never forget a couple years of doing that. And a good friend of mine happened to be, at that time, we were selling the steers right off the cows at grass time in early April. And man, they sell. But like you say, I love the options. We have a lot of options, But anyway, of course, they're not weighing that much because they've been on the cow grazing through 30 inches of snow. And he looked at me, and he looked at the calves, and he shook his head, and he said, "Gabe, why so small?" And I answered him just quick as can be. I said, "So I can make a profit." That was my answer. And he could not. He just looked at me and walked away. But that's it, right? So I can make a profit.
Gabe, that is so true. That was one of the toughest things for me to get my mind wrapped around, because when you grow up in that high input grain system, and then you get to this time of year and you're looking at these calves, and then you're beating your head against the wall like, oh my, what have I done? And that's the way my dad was. And then all of a sudden the best thing that I did was just listen to people, and they, when they told me, like, just stick with it. It'll be okay. Just stick with it. And it is absolutely phenomenal. You're exactly right. Because you're going to take this green animal, and I mean, it's like a nuclear bomb when they get on grass.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
and the fun thing is you're making more profit doing it. The easiest money you'll ever make is money you don't spend,
Exactly.
And you've got money in your pocket now. And I would contend the animals are healthier, and you're doing right by the resource. It's a win-win-win situation.
I think, Gabe, one of the coolest things, I was just visiting actually with my loan officer this morning about this. Like, so when you wean this time of year, if we compare that to when we weaned in December, Okay. Those calves, it wouldn't matter if it was conventional or the way we do it now. But one of the things I observed when we went to the later weaning was when we would wean those calves in December, it was the stress levels on me and the calves was unbelievable. So not only are the stress levels high, but you've just put this calf in a window where it's doomed from December until now. And you're going to put them in the most stressful time of the year without their mother. And here on this ranch, Gabe, we put up sheds and everything just for that, because we would wean those calves at that time of year. So what I found when I went to a late, like this winter, we had the most snow here we've ever had. And people told me it would be a train wreck having those calves with those cows. And I'll tell both of you, it was the best thing ever, because the cows would stand behind the hill ranges, or they would go down in the ponds where the cattails, or the ponds that are dried up, or the cattail. The cows would find protection, and the calves would stay right with them, like it should always have been. And so, yes, Gabe, more profit, less calf death loss, more. We can even go down this road, Gabe. More positive epigenetics all around is probably the biggest thing that I've noticed. Like, why we went in there and decided to separate those calves from those cows. Now that I've seen it the other way and the positive epigenetic influence, those cows are teaching those calves how to graze in the worst time, the hardest time of the year, or I should say the harshest time of the year, whether it's deep snow, and they're learning all of that as we go. It's just, there's so many positive things.
Was there anything you would change about that transition to May, June calving? I think that to me, it sounds like there was potential for a cash flow crunch, right? Going from selling calves every year to keeping them all the way through to yearlings and stuff like that. So was it the fallout and the cull cows that made the difference as far as the cash flow was concerned, or how did you guys manage that? And would you do anything differently as far as that transition?
That's a good question, Clay. I've pondered on that a little bit, but you're exactly right. It was the cull cow. It was the development of, that cull cow market that bridged that gap easily, for sure. Because that was one of the big things. We kept looking at that calf, the hole in there, I guess you would say. But then we got to realizing you're actually not only the cull cows, but such a huge reduction in inputs on the front side of it. Made up, and that was probably the biggest thing that my dad kept telling me, because I would panic. Like, I'm like, oh my God, Dad, we're losing these cows. We're breeding heifers back into it, but this is gonna end up being a train wreck pretty soon. And like my dad kept saying, well, think about the reduction in inputs. I mean, that is staggering. We probably put up, Clay, at the most 300 bales, 400 bales of prairie hay now, compared to 2,000 in the past. And so, we don't have any employees now. So you've got a reduction in labor. You've got a reduction in hay inputs, but you've increased carrying capacity. So another big thing, Clay, to answer your question, to bridge the gap, and this is great, and it just dawned on me. It's take-in cattle. Take-in cattle is an absolute. I love it. I mean, and my banker loves it, because we know, right? Yeah, we know right away. We already know we can take in. We're bringing in $50,000 right now, and so it's easy money. I mean,
Matt, you do realize pretty soon there will be a major strain on that relationship with the banker, because you're not going to need him pretty soon.
That's exactly right, Gabe.
He might not give you a $50,000 coat anymore.
I I got to say one thing about my banker. He's he's a little older than I am, but he's done a tremendous job he comes out probably 2 or 3 times a year and rides around with me. And he's been tremendous on diving into all this and learning about this whole process. And the more we visit and the more he talks to me about his business and looking at different portfolios, the cow-calf industry is in need of some help. And I'm glad Gabe's talking on the profits and, all of this. There's so much positive to this, but it's the peer pressure and, well, Gabe, I think you've said it before. It's the lack of knowledge. And I think the more that those of us that have done this can get out and share our knowledge, as we shared, when I started the podcast talking about the football. I mean, in the football world, knowledge is shared. I mean, there's playbooks given, offense and defensively. Film is shared. There is no secrets in that world. And I think all of us can see that people make good money in that world, even sharing their information. And so I think that needs to be the case here. We have, we talked about earlier. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to interject. To me, that's one of the really beautiful things about regenerative agriculture. Those who are involved are truly willing to share. Absolutely. They don't look at their fellow farmers and ranchers as competitors. We look at them as partners and learn from each other and how to move forward. That's probably one of the most rewarding things of being in this space.
5.5 years of doing this podcast, 5.5 years of doing this podcast, and I've only ever had one person flat out say no to coming on. And that person, I would say, is not in regenerative agriculture necessarily, but has a very good story to tell from another perspective. So yeah, that's a testimony to that truth right there.
Absolutely. It makes me think of Alejandro, Gabe. Alejandro and I were visiting, and Alejandro's if we can do this regenerative ranching on my ranch, Alejandro's ranch, or wherever, and then I get my neighbors to do it, well, pretty soon I've got a large area that is healing and changing weather patterns, and the water
healing your community,
healing the community, Gabe. Yep. That's
how many ghost towns are there along Highway 2 across Nebraska?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly. Yes.
You go west or go east out of Alliance, and there's a lot of dried up little towns there that would be regenerated along with the soil.
Exactly. More productive. I mean, you're exactly right, guys. Exactly.
So, you talked early on about set stocking, and I think it was 4 sections, and now you're up to 100 paddocks. To a lot of people, that's going to sound like it takes more labor. Does it take more labor to do what you're doing than it does what you used to do?
Absolutely. No, actually it takes less labor. And surprisingly, though, what's interesting, the biggest thing I'll throw out there, and I have it written here above my computer at my desk right here. The biggest thing we had to learn when we got into this is you want to lead, you don't push. And the reason I say that is when we got into this, we kept pushing our cows and we kept pushing yearlings into the next paddock, or we'd push them here, push them there. And it got to be a nightmare at the start. And then when we learned how to lead cattle, and whether that can be a lot of our cows, we'll take just a half a bucket of cake and drive through them with the side-by-side, and we'll rattle the cake bucket, and here they come, and then we lead them. So our cows, we show them where the gate is, and then we lead. Yep. And then we come back the next day, and at least probably 90% of them have moved. To give you an idea on the workload, my oldest just graduated last year, and and then I have two daughters. My son's the oldest. He just graduated last year. And then I have two daughters. One's a junior in high school and the other one's a fourth grader. Those kids can move 400 head of cows by themselves. I mean, just open the gate or move the poly wire. I mean, you're talking stringing poly wire. I mean, even if you do, like when we were doing the mile poly wire, you're still probably talking hour and a half tops to string it. I mean, it's really not that. Here's a great way of putting it. So my dad says, Clay, you're going to do something on the ranch. So you're either going to move fence and move cows, or you're going to put up hay, or you know what I mean? So my biggest deal, Clay, is I signed up to be a rancher, and I like working with cows in the land. I didn't sign up to ride a tractor and put up hay. And so that's the way my dad always looked at it is, okay, we can rotate the cows, we can build diversity, we can build all of this, regenerate this ranch through these practices, or we can keep going down the same road, ride the tractor. So you're going to do something no matter what, is what I'm saying. And it's just how you want to allocate that time.
Yep. And I think that it's a lot of the labor that happens in a more conventional system is a lot more time restricted. It has to be done at this time. Or, haying is a perfect example of that. You've got to put up the hay when it's right to be put up. Yep. You don't really get to schedule that in. Whereas with a move, you can schedule those almost. You can almost schedule moves, and go out and do those when it works for your labor and those kinds of things. And then on top of that, when you've got weaned calves standing in a feed yard, they're not going to go find feed. Mom's not going to help them find feed. You are mom. You got to bring feed to them. So, those kinds of things where it's a very, very definitive, this has to be done now. Nobody else is going to do it unless we do it. Whereas when you find working cows, right, when you put your cows to work for you, they're going to do a lot. They're going to do a lot of that, carry a lot of that labor load for you.
Yeah. So to touch on that labor real quick, Clay, just popped in my mind to give people an idea on our cows and labor. Because right now, especially around here, probably around everywhere, I mean, labor is super high right now because we're all calving in the coldest time of year. And I see the stress loads on my neighbors, stress loads enough that at times it bothers me. Like, you don't have to put yourself through this. And so I've even made it a point here, Clay, in the last 2 years, like we've talked about earlier, I just weaned my calves, and I mean, we've got, most of our snow is melted, and my cows, Clay, will go 5 miles from the house. There is no corrals. There is nothing. And they calve on their own. Like we'll go down there and sift the dries and the late breds back towards the house to sell them in July. But those cows that have calved are on their own. And we did that because I was by myself with kids in high school or young kids. And Dad and I talked like, how are we going to do this? And so, of course, I was told, it's going to be a disaster. We're going to lose all these cows and lose all these calves. It was fine. Matter of fact, I think it's better. Yeah. And so those cows are 5 miles from the house. We probably go down there maybe once a day and drive through them. But to me, Clay, it was natural. Let's get back to this cow herd being natural. Like, let them do. It's, all of those things. So right. I thought that was interesting, kind of a neat idea.
Yeah. And you've mentioned those short, thick cattle. A lot of what makes a short and thick cow is her bone structure. And actually, if you start to pay attention, a lot of what makes calving ease is actually bone structure too. Are they sloped from hooks to pins? It opens up a bigger circle for that calf to shoot out of, whereas exactly. If they're level from hooks to pins, they're trying to shoot through something, like the thickness of a piece of paper rather than the thickness of a basketball. And so it becomes a lot harder for them because of their body shape. And it turns out that those are the cows that do well on forage too. So it's almost like it was all designed to fit together or something. So
the toughest part about all that, I think, Gabe, you can probably relate to this. The toughest thing about those genetics, Clay, is finding them. Yep. And, at visiting with Alejandro, Dr. Williams, and all these guys, you about got to make your own anymore, right? Because you're going to have a hard time finding those genetics.
Yeah, I think over time, nature will select them out of your herd. They're probably already there. You just didn't see them. I think every herd's got them. What's been the biggest challenge going down this path? You mentioned peer pressure earlier. Is that the biggest challenge? Yep. Would you say?
I really do, Clay. I really think it's the biggest. It's the hardest because I've seen so many. I've talked to Shane, Jim Garish, or we've all talked about this over the years, and I'm sure, Clay, you've had people on here that talk about the same thing. It's the biggest thing of pulling your hat down and not listening to, because you're the black sheep. I mean, you're out there. You're and so it's that. To me, it was that. I mean, for me, when I made what I tell people, Clay, is I was the generation that turned upside down the way a ranch had been managed the last 60 years. And so when it comes to open cows, when we're going to market calves, doing a grass rotation, why the wasted grass, I mean, you name it. Everyone at the coffee shop is like, what in the world is that kid doing? And Clay, your intuition, those of us that work with the land, there's something telling you that this is right. But most of us hide that intuition, like it can't be right. This isn't, you know what I mean? And we don't listen to that I don't know what you would call it, that higher spirit guiding. I know that gets wild, but that higher spirit is guiding you. But yet we keep pushing it to the side because surely that's not right. But once I listened to that intuition and started I'm going to do it, all of these opportunities start presenting themselves that weren't there earlier. But the hardest thing, Clay, is just telling yourself, I should say it like this, Clay, it's lonely because you don't have a neighbor to go talk to. Yep. And there's not a guy 10 miles away to talk to. You gotta find somebody like Alejandro or Jim or Gabe or, and then those guys help you, but they're not in the same environment. So, what works for them, I think, Gabe would like it if I mentioned context. I mean, the contexts are so different. The principles are all the same, but the contexts are different. Yep. And so I think honestly, the peer pressure was the hardest. The rest of it, I mean, the numbers, figuring out the financials, I'm not a numbers guy. I've made myself a numbers guy, but that was all fairly easy to figure out. Yeah. And I guess the other thing, Clay, was just finding the knowledge out there of how to do it. Yeah. Like when I started, Gabe was just starting. When I went to Jim Garish's management intensive grazing in Mississippi, I think Gabe was just kind of on the horizon right then. And so, I mean, there wasn't this huge amount of knowledge. You had ranching for profit. You had, the holistic management, the other side of that. So there really wasn't a lot. Now, with your podcast and all of this, understanding ag, ranching, there's so many avenues now, and it's just getting better and better. So, yeah, roundabout, for me, it was probably just the peer pressure.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think that we were designed. I think God created a world that works in a certain way, right? And I think that when we get in sync with how He designed it to work, that's what you're talking about. We were created to manage the earth, right? We were created to fill the earth and subdue it. And
Exactly.
I think that's why, that's what you're talking about, that deep sense of, oh, this is right. This is right. This is true. This is good. So yeah, I really think that it's right.
I think, Clay, to go along just with what you said, for me, just the whole later weaning. I mean, I beat myself up over that. Maybe we should put a grow yard in, and maybe we should do this, and maybe we should do that. But the more I sat here in my office and I would visit with, like I said before, visit with Burke Tykert, I would visit with those people, Clay, but it was the intuition. It was that higher spirit that's like, no, this is what we need to do. Like, this is right. I mean, those other guys like Burke reinforced it, listening to Gabe talk, that reinforced it. But there was something driving me, and I was just like, okay, well, we're going to do it. And I worried the entire time. But now I look back on it, and it was like, I'm just glad I listened to it, because it was right. It was the right thing to do.
Right.
I mean, it was in sync with nature. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So what have you found the most rewarding on this journey? What's been the most rewarding thing?
Absolutely. And that's a great question. I love to answer this for people. The most rewarding thing, Clay, is it brought my whole family into the picture. And what I mean by that is, in a traditional, conventional ranch setting, more than likely the oldest male or whatever it is going to come back and run the ranch, and there's no opportunity for the rest of the family members. And when we got into this, Clay, I mean, my son's a herdsman. He likes working with the cattle. My second daughter is big. Actually, both of my daughters are big into, the plant diversity, the structure of just the whole planning of the cells. I mean, there's plant identification, there's soil biology. My youngest, who, like I said, is a fourth grader, likes to dig the holes, likes to look at the roots, likes to, we're looking for soil microbiology, we're looking for earthworms. So there's these opportunities, Clay, that we're never testing bricks. Sorry, I just seen a picture on my computer. We're testing the bricks levels. We're taking the plant tissue, and I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with that. But if not, we're squeezing the juice out of the leaves, putting it on a refractometer, and then looking at the sugar, or the sugar content of that leaf tissue. So those kids, they're fired up about that. They're testing bricks levels all the time. They're doing water infiltration. So it actually got all of our family members involved, and it gave them opportunities maybe to go on and get a better education, in all these different parts of the adaptive grazing. So yeah, I think for me that's probably the biggest, is it finally included everybody. And then, like I mentioned earlier with Gabe about Dad, like it's fun for the older generation, Clay, because it puts a spark back in their eye. Like, they see hope into the future, and then they start to see practices that maybe they've done in the past, and we've forgotten those practices. And now it's showing them that it was right. What they did was right. And so I think just the whole family involvement.
Yep, for sure. So last question. How do you explain what you are doing to your neighbors? When you talk to neighbors about what you're doing, how do you explain it?
I think, I'll tell you a great example. I have a neighbor that calves in May and June, the same time we do, but he doesn't do quite the rotation that I do. And he was over here, and he's an older generation. He's probably he's probably older than that. He's probably 20 years older than I am. And he knows how we had managed our ranch in the past. And then he was over here one day, and we were just randomly taking soil probe. We're soil probemen and looking at the soil organic matter and everything. And it just blew his mind. And we started looking at what we call the second bench area, where we have the low ground, we have the second bench, and then we have the hillside and the hilltop. On our ranch, the second bench has always been overhayed, overgrazed, and other people, that's all they've ever seen. And so when we were riding the side by side, and he's seen all these changes, it just blew his mind. And so, to answer your question, Clay, for me, what I like to do, I don't really tell them a whole lot, but I encourage them to come visit. And I don't try to explain it to them at the coffee shop, because it's going to go over their head. But I like to keep it open and come out and let's ride around. And, let me show you. Like we talked before, like Gabe, we have all these cool tools now. We can dig and look at root structure. I can show them all different grazing strategies, 3-day windows, 14-day windows, all these different strategies we've done here over the years, and you can see the results. And so I think that's the biggest thing is I try not to overwhelm them at the coffee shop, because like I said before, the biggest one's the wasted grass. Why the wasted grass? And so I'll giggle and be like, well, there's a reason. Why don't you come to the ranch and then we'll dig into it.
Sure.
And then once they see it, then, the lights come on and it makes it an easier transition. So,
right. Yep. Yeah. It's just like, well, let's do some math. Why do I have grass when you're looking for grass? It's because I'm intentionally leaving it there for later.
Exactly. So. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think that's the biggest, I think like Alejandro and I talked one time, the biggest thing is to make it very encouraging for people to do. Yep. And try not to overwhelm them. Like, so many times we'll sit in and listen to these speakers and we get overwhelmed by it. And we just want you to know, like, hey, if we put a fence here, maybe add some water, maybe we don't add some water, maybe we just put a fence, and we just, kind of slowly work our way into that and help you with that. We just don't want to make it overwhelming, like I said before. So,
yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, very good. So has this changed, the shift? Has it enabled you to come home full time and be on the ranch full time? Is that part of how that worked?
Ultimately, yes. But I think the biggest thing, well, I can tell you the biggest thing, Clay. When we did this, the goal was to run more cattle and make more money. I mean, that was when we went to Ranching for Profit. That's what we were going to do. We were going to run more cattle, and we're gonna make all this money doing all these rotations and everything. And then actually what happened was, as the more we learned and we saw how the land was healing, we got to notice that there's more and more opportunity for, all those, like I mentioned before, all those different family members, not only myself, but now we've opened up more opportunity for the rest of our kids, and the ranch is now more sustainable. So, yeah, I think ultimately the goal was, I was going to be here, and, we're going to make more money. We're going to run more cows. And ultimately what happened was all of those things came true, but there was so much more to it than just money and running more cows. And so, yeah, now the opportunities are just really, Clay, the opportunities are just endless, because like Alejandro and I talked, I don't know how much grass our country can grow. Not here, even at Alejandro's place. Alejandro and I talk about this all the time. Like, yeah. I don't think we know really how much grass or how much productivity is there.
Right. Yeah.
So,
at the time of this recording, I don't think one of our episodes that I've done with Gabe and Alan has come out yet, but we were talking about that, and he said people ask Alejandro how much rain he gets per year, and he says, "Oh, I get around 9 inches, but I don't really need that much," So I mean, like it's it's already outpacing what he can get around as far as productivity is concerned. So it's pretty
Absolutely.
cool. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Matt, very good stuff. Is there anything else that you really wanted to make sure people heard today as we talked about this?
No, man, I think, we hit a bunch of it. I mean, there'll be things, later on, Clay, there might be things that come up for you. There'll probably be things that come up for me. And I mean, we can always do another one down the road because there's so much. I mean, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts and you've got repeat people on because there is so much information to it, whether it's financials, like we talked with the cow herd, the grazing structures, whether how you do paddock design. I mean, there's so much involved in it. But I think we hit quite a bit of it.
And I'll probably throw up some of those pictures that you sent me, Matt, in that show notes page. And really, the really striking one is that Google Earth image of those blowout areas and the healing of those places. So I'll probably include those in the show notes page for today at workingcows.net/293. But Matt, thanks for your time today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Clay. It was a great time. Thank you very much.
Very good stuff there with Matt, of course. As always, very good stuff with Gabe. He had to jump off there towards the end of that conversation, so I wasn't able to say goodbye to him. Didn't want to interrupt Matt as he was on a roll there. Very much appreciate his perspective and what he had to share, and continue to look forward to these episodes. Got another one coming up, another one already in the tank, ready to be released here in a couple of weeks on the consolidation in the dairy industry and how soil health practices and some of those things can be implemented, and the opportunities that exist to implement soil health practices in the dairy industry and some of those things. So really would encourage you to consider attending an Understanding Ag Soil Health Academy. They are great resources. I've talked to some people who have been to them. Myself, I have not been to one, but I've talked to some people who have, and they really speak very highly of them. And as a matter of fact, this next episode with them that's due out in a couple of weeks is going to be talking about the dairy industry. And they are hosting a Understanding Ag Soil Health Academy at the Schmitz Dairy, and so there will be an opportunity to go and to see how a dairy is implementing these kinds of things. And I think that there's lessons for us as beef people to learn from them. There's lessons that every sector of agriculture, every sector of livestock agriculture can learn from other sectors, and obviously, those that are more regeneratively focused, as the Schmitz and the Willenbring families are going to be the kind of operations that we can learn the most from if we are adapting or adopting these regenerative principles. So I'd encourage you to check that out. It will be linked in the show notes page as well today at workingcows.net/293. So go there and check that out. And we look forward to the next episode of the Working Cows podcast coming your way in just a few days with another opportunity to sit down and talk to Dr. Ken Olson, one of the smarter people in agriculture today, I think. Very much appreciate his perspective. And he's got a new apprentice there under him at the Extension Service in South Dakota for the South Dakota State University, and that is Jalen Whaley. And we will be talking to them about the need for sheep in the Mountain West to control brush encroachment and also small ruminants in general. Dr. Olson has a wealth of experience in that regard, doing his master's and PhD work in places like Utah and New Mexico on specifically small ruminants in those places. And as I went on a elk hunting trip recently and saw the brush encroachment in some of those areas, I thought, this place needs, I think the number I came up with was about 10,000 goats. And so, going to talk to Ken and in the providence of God. Jalen is from the area where I was elk hunting at. She's kind of a little bit east of where I was elk hunting at, but she is from that area, and so she's very familiar with it and knows and understands the need for small ruminants to do what they do best in that part of the world. So we're going to talk to them about that coming up real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.